This video is being uploaded to debunk medical misinformation, fake news, etc., and mostly propaganda, about subjects concerning something I'm not an expert in. I will be citing sources and doing my best to get the information correct. Consider this at worst a high schooler's grade of research and at best a college level. Vaccines and the diseases they're supposed to prevent. Polio vaccine and polio. Polio is a highly infectious disease that can cause an incurable, crippling paralysis and or death in young children, and other ages too, apparently. And it's transmitted through, and I'm going to put scare quotes around it, incomplete sanitation. Now, why am I saying incomplete sanitation? Because I'm not supposed to tell you exactly what it is until I get it nailed into your head to where you are not allowed to ignore it, what that means. Inactivated poliovirus or killed poliovirus usually has to be given by intramuscular or intradermal injection, a syringe needle. Oral polio vaccine doesn't, but it requires that you use a live, weakened, attenuated, or mutated version of poliovirus that doesn't have the ability to harm someone, and as a side effect, because it's still technically alive, and through incomplete sanitation conditions, has a habit of itself spreading as a virus that causes little or no problems with anyone, maybe not even an infection, maybe not even a reaction. But, yes, that's a joke right there, it does have the ability to spread in conditions that are worse conditions than you would have in the United States, meaning it will spread as fast as the disease among the population, incidentally inoculating them. That wasn't necessarily what they were trying to go for, but it's a happenstance capability, and that's good, or not. But it doesn't require an injection. The other one requires a trained medical person to do it, and people have a problem with that. 1952, in the United States, 879 people got sick, mostly children. It is presumed 60,000 were paralyzed. I can't find any definitive numbers. They're not anywhere proper, so I'm just going to skip that. But it's around 6,000 paralyzed, and 3,145 were killed by this disease. This isn't one of those things where you're allowed to make any of the arguments like people do on a particular side of the political spectrum for some reason. This causes a case fatality rate of 5.4% for that 1 year. That's the gross case fatality rate. And this isn't something where you have, an inability to determine this. But it is possible, yes, there were possibly asymptomatic carriers. Okay, fine. 1955, the first polio vaccine was available in the USA, and yes, there's a tragedy associated with it here, but we're going to do that at the end. Let's talk about what happened afterwards. By 1962, instead of almost 60,000 sick per year, we had 910. Instead of 3,000 dead, we had 60. Instead of presumably 6,000 paralyzed, we had under 100, probably 90 people paralyzed. Now, the reason in the beginning nobody really made note of the paralyzed is it was about did he die or did she die, not just give me my kid back, I'll deal with what I got. And the paralysis could be variable from losing some function in one leg all the way to not being able to walk. But by 1962, with only 60 dead and only 91 paralyzed, which sounds horrible for me to say that, and a case fatality rate that's higher, technically, at 6.6% death rate, there were so few people being harmed more than that number that they only paid attention to the death rate and illness rate. So the records are screwed. Okay, let's go on. 1965, 72 were sick, 16 dead, no paralysis case listed, which would be presumably 32 people, but there is none. There is actually a note that there weren't any. But the case fatality rate, which would seem scary if you read this, is 22%. As you reduce the number of people who are ill, there's a certain effectively minimum number that die, and that does this. So you could claim in 3 years the case fatality rate went from 6% to 20%, if you wanted to. And I've seen anti-vaxxers say very big numbers instead. By 1981, we had a case fatality rate of 0 for the first time, and we had 6 people get sick, and apparently nobody got paralyzed. And the year 2000 was the first 12-month period where we had nobody even getting the disease or dying from it from the previous year of having it. There were no cases of death or infection from polio. It was still a threat since a traveler from any other country could come to the country or any other country and spread it. And if anyone wasn't vaccinated, they could become a carrier, get sick and carry it, have it recur later, or just get sick from it and die. And it spreads very fast, again, from incomplete sanitation. Now, I'm going to remind you, in 1952, America, the golden age for most people thinking of America, with indoor toilets being the primary concern, that everybody had one or had access to them. And everybody had access to soap and water for many years before that. This was still spreading and killing children. Incomplete sanitation does not mean third world country. It means that you would have to clean yourself like a doctor. Next. Same year, 2000, the instant they had 0% death or infection for a full year, they switched over to inactivated polio vaccine as standard and would not authorize use of oral vaccine because the oral vaccine, again, was technically a live vaccine. It was essentially useless. It wouldn't do anything. It would just give you an immune system response, but it still wasn't necessary. It's an unnecessary microscopic risk. It became the only one in the U.S. It's now given in 4 doses when you're 2 months old, 4 months old, 12 months old, around that, about a year old, and then finally just before preschool, like 5 or 6 years of age. 2015, type 2 poliovirus was declared to be eradicated in most places, if not the entire world. That left type 1 and type 3 available. But people were still using the oral vaccine and the inactivated polio vaccine set that had all 3 to immunize because it could possibly transfer from one area to another, and 2 hadn't been completely declared out. 1 billion doses of oral polio vaccine a year were still used in other countries, and as of today's date, and also further back, Nigeria, Afghanistan, Pakistan, those are the only places in the world you can actually see real polio. However, there were reported cases of polio-like symptoms from the vaccine. That's why we stopped using it in the United States at all if it was the vaccine that could actually do anything beyond immunize. 2018, there were 30 reported cases at all, and they were all in Afghanistan and Pakistan, but they were type 1 and 3. By 2019, 30 wild polio cases were all in December of 2017 in Pakistan only. It was their worst month since 2017. Oral vaccine is a live attenuated virus. It can become an active virus. It can mutate. It's not genetically perfectly stable. And obviously, it's because it was created originally from polio itself, polio virus, and derived from it. But that's before we could genetically sequence things or use mRNA-style vaccines, which aren't really vaccines. They tell your body to make it. Let's continue. Anyway, vaccine-derived polio virus type 1, 2, and especially type 3 can cause an associated paralysis like polio, and it can be temporary or long-term. Now remember, originally 60,000 cases just in the United States and 3,000 dead and 6,000 paralyzed. Let's look at the numbers now. 75 cases reported each year worldwide of vaccine-caused polio. I'm just going to call it polio because I'm not going to call it its technical term because it's vaccine-derived polio. Worldwide, the cases per year were this. In 2009, the worst year we ever had any cases of vaccine-caused, we're going to call it vaccine-caused polio, 180 worldwide for an entire year. Now let's scroll back up really quickly. That's like 1960s United States. Well, yeah. And that's as bad as the 1960s United States after we got rid of the 60,000 a year just in the United States almost. This is 180 worldwide. Vaccine-induced went down in 2018 to 102 cases in 7 countries. But it was still there. The year 2000 to 2018, out of 18 years, and 10 billion oral doses that could possibly cause something, and 3 billion kids who could possibly have this happen to them. We had 1,200 vaccine-associated cases of polio. That doesn't mean they were paralyzed. That just means they got sick, or at least we could confirm it was caused by that. That averages 66 a year worldwide. That's like 1 down from 60,000 in the United States per year. That's out of 10 billion doses, 3 billion children. They had 100 temporary or permanent paralysis cases, or partial paralysis, like just in the arm it came into. That's averaging 5 a year of actual long-term or short-term effect. Every year, 5 kids. That's bad. And obviously just switching over to the injectable makes it 0. Inappropriate handling, contamination, production errors, or error in medical errors. 1955, this is when we first got the vaccine in the United States. The Cutter and Waith labs, or companies, put out 200,000 worth of kid inoculations, vaccines. 50-50 chance of getting one that wasn't quite killed enough. These were they were supposed to be inactivated, but they were full copies of the real polio virus. This caused 40,000 polio cases, even though around 100,000 children were injected, about 40% chance of actually coming down with it. They had 10 deaths out of that number. It was partially inactivated, or it was partially killed, usually by boiling. That's when people in the United States saw headlines, the vaccine works, and then a couple of weeks later, literally, 40,000 children had polio, and 10 died. And we can presume from the numbers there that they probably had several thousand become paralyzed. Again, I can't get the accurate numbers because mostly I look it up and it's newspaper reports where they're playing it up. They're not giving us data. 1966. Deaths after vaccination were all U.S. deaths, which were small enough number we can't confirm it, but less than a dozen, were from people who were immunocompromised. That means they were doing cancer treatments and they weren't able to fight disease, or they had a bad immune system. All of them that one year. That's the last year we found any associated with it, and it's associated with it. They don't really believe it was actually caused by the vaccine. Peru vaccination program. 4 immunodeficient or immunocompromised patients. 1 long-term steroid user died, and 10 polio patients died. Okay, let's rephrase that. In Peru, during the vaccination program in 1966, 10 people who were going to die from polio were injected with a vaccine and died anyway. They didn't know they had polio yet. They were still in the communicable disease area timing, and they were coming down with it. It was still incubating. But technically, that's 10 deaths. 1979 to 1990, deaths. People using oral vaccine, 1. 1 using the injection. 1 using the injection and other vaccines. 445 reports of oral use with other vaccines. 45 a year. But when they only had the oral vaccine, they didn't have any deaths. But an anti-vaxxer will say it has to be only the oral, or it has to be polio vaccine. Think of all the different vaccines were given out. 1980 to 1991, people with vaccine-associated polio, 5 deaths, 1 every 2 years. This is worldwide data. This isn't concentrated. 1990, 1992, we have an anomaly of 133 per year dead from oral vaccine with other vaccines, but also, comparison, 1 only using oral and 1 only using injection, which you have to blame the oral vaccine because it has to be polio vaccine, or it could have been contamination, etc. In India, 1991, the only deaths that happened from vaccination were because people didn't properly sterilize reusable needles and gave people Staph aureus infections directly in their bloodstream. They died from being injected with bacteria. Is even 1 death worth blah, blah? No, that's not how it works. We go from 60,000 a year sick, 6,000 paralyzed, and 3,000 dead a year to almost none. Or when you have to scrape together every death on the planet and close your eyes about the fact that it was probably caused by something else like an injection. But yes, in 1955, 2 companies did a horrible thing and didn't sterilize the vaccine well enough, and it caused polio. Almost as bad as 3 or 4 years before when they didn't have a vaccine of any kind. You're going to hold that against all vaccines because someone had to spend the next 20 years after that point with a kid that was paralyzed. I understand that, but we're a little further along now. I'm sorry, but I don't think vaccines like this are a problem. Thanks for watching. Have a good day. Good luck with that.